Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our office hours today. Today, we will be looking at cognitive science, and we're going to be learning how the brain thinks, how we remember stuff. So, without any further ado, I have today here with me Spencer Ziegler. He's going to be leading most of the session today. And for our objectives today, what we will hope to achieve, we're going to gain an understanding of cognitive science principles of retrieval practice, the spacing effect, interleaving, and the amygdala. Our next objective for today, identify the opportunities to apply cognitive science tips into daily work. So I have a question here for you before I hand it over to Spencer. Why is learning how the brain works beneficial for staff and students? Now, if you don't mind, I would love for you to answer that question in the chat, or you can go ahead and raise your hand and just share.
Yeah, we got an answer in the chat that it helps people learn more efficiently. I think that word efficient is key, that if you know how your brain works, you can kind of tap into some of the strategies, make sure you're using your time wisely. And Roger has an answer. Roger, if you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, I mean, the goal is to really help students learn in an optimal way. And if there are secrets being revealed by the new science about how their brains work that will really help teachers, then I think, it's a great, reason for staff, for teachers to be interested in this.
Yeah. Yeah, and Katie talking about how each student learns, looking at it so you can tap into that. And I think it can help us to figure out, especially some of those little pockets of time at like the beginning or end of lesson. If you know how the brain works, it can help you to figure out just what kids are going to retain as you're teaching.
And I like what Hagen says here, help us to learn more efficiently. All right, Spencer, so it's off to you.
Yeah, so I'll say we're going to be talking briefly about 4 different cognitive science principles, the amygdala, retrieval practice, spacing effect, and interleaving. And I'll say we go into a lot more depth on a post that's on Wake Connect, that at this bit.ly right here, bit.ly/cog/sci post, those capitals matter when you're plugging in. And that will take you to a lot more information on each, along with a corresponding video for each of these. The videos are meant to perhaps be useful for students, probably at the secondary level, so that they can kind of learn how their brain works and use that when they're studying and learning, so that they can, as I can point out, learn more efficiently. Caveat that I am not a cognitive scientist. This is just something I'm interested in, so I wanted to kind of review some of the research and relay it onto educators to see if that might help you guys with your jobs. So we're going to start with the amygdala. And for this, we're going to begin where I have a kind of short, just 2-minute video that Serena and I put together that's, again, meant to be for teachers or maybe for students as well, that kind of gives some information. We'll only show the first video just out of respect for your time, but the other ones are available through that link that we just shared. So I'll click on this, and then I'm just going to need to switch over to this tab. Let me know if the audio doesn't come through, though it should be.
Good, we can hear it.
Imagine for a moment, you're living thousands and thousands of years ago, searching the landscape for berries. All of a sudden, you spot off in the distance a saber-toothed tiger. Do you suppose your brain is going to be focusing on identifying the types of plants around you so that it can track down the sweetest berries? Of course not. Every resource you've got is going to be used to try to stay safe in the face of imminent danger. Although we're probably a little less at risk of tiger attacks now, our brain still works essentially the same way. One of the first things our brains do when confronting a new environment is determining whether there is a threat. This is the work of the amygdala. If there's a physical or emotional threat, we release the cortisol and adrenaline to prepare for it. When this happens, the body goes into a fight or flight mode like it might if a saber-toothed tiger was approaching. But when we're feeling safe, then the information is able to get past the amygdala and get routed by the hippocampus to the prefrontal cortex. That's where information is analyzed and neural connections are made. In other words, where long-term memories are formed. So meaningful learning only occurs when the amygdala isn't triggered. The takeaway here is that feeling comfortable and at ease is not the result of learning, but rather that it must be in place in order for you to be able to learn. So consider what variables you can control in your learning environment, be it at school or while studying at home. Do whatever you can to feel comfortable and open to learning. Doing so will make it significantly more likely that what you are learning truly sticks with you. That is how knowing a little bit more about your amygdala can help you learn how to learn.
Okay, so that's an example of some of the videos that we have as a resource in case that's going to be helpful for y'all. And so the main takeaway, I'll just talk in brief about each of these principles, is that you're better off investing time to ensure that learners are comfortable and confident rather than just diving right into instruction. And to be honest, this is something that I wish I had kind of considered a little bit more when I was in the classroom. You figure billions of bits of information are bombarding our brain like every single second. So really learning is about what of those bits ends up making it past the amygdala and into our long-term memory so that we're able to recall those and pull those out and use them when it's needed. And the amygdala is the key there, because if the amygdala is tagging something as a threat, if the amygdala isn't comfortable, then that's when you get that fight or flight with cortisol. That's when you get students either kind of zoning out or acting out. So them feeling comfortable and at ease and not feeling anxious is not the result of learning, but a prerequisite for it. So that's why I wanted to start with that one, because everything else after that doesn't matter if you don't first make it past the amygdala. The next three principles we're going to look at are all kind of rooted in this idea of retention and the ability to pull something out of the long-term memory. So to ground us in this, I'm going to reference just some research that actually goes back to the 1880s by a German psychologist, Hermann Ebbinghaus, the forgetting curve. You might have seen this before. Now, it's a model, and like all models, it's overly simplistic. But essentially what this guy did was he did a study where he gave his students nonsense words, and then he would check the retention for them. And he found like this green bar is looking at just without any repetition. 6 days later, they're only recalling like 20% of them. But with each time that you're repeating, all of a sudden then the retention improves a little bit more and a little bit more. So that's kind of, each of these is rooted in that idea that learning means first getting things into long-term memory by passing by the amygdala, and then after that, practicing taking things out of long-term memory. And that's the basic idea with the principle of retrieval practice. Essentially that you're better off trying to take previously learned material out of the brain rather than trying to put it back into the brain. I was reading Cult of Pedagogy, did an interview with Pooja Agarwal, and she pointed out that the brain storage is the equivalent of like 1 million gigabytes worth of storage. So that's like 8,000 iPhones. So essentially what that means is just the stuff that has been taught, it's in the kid's brain somewhere. So just rereading the notes or something is kind of pointless because it's already there. The question is whether kids can kind of get into their minds and find where it was stored and pull it out, and how efficiently and effectively they can do so. So this idea with retrieval practice says that learning and studying means practicing getting stuff out of the memory. So instead of just glossing over the notes or rereading the textbook again, you want to practice getting stuff out of that memory. So that's where practice tests are really helpful. That's where kids testing themselves is really beneficial. Flashcards or brain dumps where kids put all their notes away and just put everything out on a paper just to see what they know, and then checking it with the notes. So that is the most, going back to what Huygens said, the most effective, the most efficient way to study. The next principle is kind of a play off of that. and that's the spacing effect. And this is looking at, it's really important for studying, saying like when you're studying, you're better off dividing that studying into as many small study sessions as possible, as opposed to kind of giant cram sessions. So for instance, you can think of like if you're given a phone number to remember, this might be a little antiquated reference with cell phones and all that, but when you're given a phone number, those like 10 digits, right? You repeat them to yourself a couple times and you can keep it in your working memory till you need to dial that, and then you're good. But are you going to remember that phone number a day later, a week later, a month later? Probably not, because it was only sitting in your working memory. It never had to make it to long-term memory and get pulled out of long-term memory with that retrieval practice. And that's essentially what we're doing when we have these cramming sessions. We're pretty much just repeating phone numbers to ourselves over and over again, but it's not actually getting back and forth from long-term memory. So instead, you really want to space out those study sessions. So instead of one big 40-minute study session the day before a test, take those 40 minutes and divide them into 4, to be honest, 8-minute sessions throughout the week, and that's going to be much more effective. It's less time, but you're using that time more effectively. So that's the idea with the spacing effect. Somewhat similar is interleaving. And this is saying that you're better off shuffling up the topics of learning rather than mastering one topic, setting aside, moving on to the next topic. So if you're, say, I don't know, a math teacher, right? Instead of saying like, okay, we're doing quadratic equations this week and just really drilling quadratic equations, then at the end of the week, you close that chapter and move on to exponential equations and just work on that till you have it down, and then move on to linear and so on and so forth, but never touching the stuff that came before it. You're better off kind of spacing those in. That doesn't necessarily mean that every day should be a different lesson, but maybe those practice problems for homework or at the end of class, mixing those in is really playing off of that spacing effect, because then they're practicing to retrieve things from that long-term memory as they're going through. Furthermore, the book How We Learn stresses that it's partially that, but it's also partially about preparing the brain for the unexpected. Because when you're just working with quadratic equations, you don't really need to think about what formula to use. It's just quadratic equations. But when you have a diverse set of math problems and your brain needs to first consider what strategy to employ, then it's doing some extra work, and that's going to make kids own the learning a little bit more. And there's research back. Scientific American did a study, a report on a study where they did a control group with 2 groups of students, some with practice problems using the interleaving effect, and some the same problems, but just in a more kind of one after the other effect. And they found that the day after the students that had the interleaving sets did 25% better, a month later 75% better. So switching things up with the interleaving effect is going to really help out to make sure that people really are getting that, pulling stuff back and forth from the long-term memory. So those are the 4 basic ideas. Amygdala, making sure that people feel comfortable so that the information can make it to long-term memory. Spacing effect, retrieval practice, getting kids pulling information in and out of that long-term memory to working memory. Spacing effect, dividing things out the study session, same amount of time, but just being a little bit more thoughtful about when you're reviewing. And interleaving, dividing up what you're studying as you're going through. All right, any questions or comments from y'all? And Serena, if you want to talk about what our next session is.
Thank you once again for joining us in our session today, What Cognitive Science Teaches Us About Learning. For our upcoming session, that's on March 9, we will have SchoolNet. We will be looking at how to do extended response items in SchoolNet. We look forward for you to join us on that day. Thank you.
All right. And actually, we have a couple of questions we can address in the chat. So one question was, how might you incorporate performance assessments with these various techniques? I think performance assessment is a good example of interleaving, because performance assessment, oftentimes what you're seeing is students bringing in a bunch of different skills and standards coming together for one authentic problem. So just as that quote about preparing the brain for the unexpected, the ability for students to pull from multiple standards, but also multiple skills that might be outside of your class and create, pulling those 4 C's, I think that's a good example of the interleaving effect at play there. All right. Well, then, thank you, everyone. You can always travel to www.wcpss.net/DRA office hours to get more information on this topic and upcoming ones. Take care.